Stephen Grover Cleveland was an American politician and lawyer who was the 22nd and 24th President of the United States. He won the popular vote for 3 presidential elections, in 1884, 1888, and 1892, and was one of 2 Democrats, with Woodrow Wilson, to be elected president during the era of Republican political domination dating from 1861 to 1933. He was also the first and to date only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office. Cleveland was the leader of the pro-business Bourbon Democrats who opposed high tariffs, free silver, inflation, imperialism, and subsidies to business, farmers, or veterans. His crusade for political reform and fiscal conservatism made him an icon for American conservatives of the era. Cleveland won praise for his honesty, self-reliance, integrity, and commitment to the principles of classical liberalism. He fought political corruption, patronage, and bossism. As a reformer, Cleveland had such prestige that the like-minded wing of the Republican Party, called Mugwumps, largely bolted the GOP presidential ticket and swung to his support in the 1884 election. As his second administration began, disaster hit the nation when the Panic of 1893 produced a severe national depression, which Cleveland was unable to reverse. It ruined his Democratic Party, opening the way for a Republican landslide in 1894 and for the agrarian and civil rights seizure of the Democratic Party in 1896. The result was a political realignment that ended the third-party system and launched the fourth-party system in the Progressive era. Cleveland was a formidable policymaker, and he also drew corresponding criticism. His intervention in the Pullman Strike of 1894 to keep the railroads moving angered labor unions nationwide in addition to the party in Illinois. His support of the gold standard and opposition to free silver alienated the agrarian wing of the Democratic Party. Critics complained that Cleveland had little imagination and seemed overwhelmed by the nation's economic disasters, depressions and strikes in his second term. Even so, his reputation for probity and good character survived the troubles of his second term. Biographer Alan Nevins wrote, quote, "I. Grover Cleveland. The greatness lies in typical rather than unusual qualities. He had no endowments that thousands of men do not have. He possessed honesty, courage, firmness, independence, and common sense, but he possessed them to a degree other men do not. Today, Cleveland is considered by most historians to have been a successful leader, generally ranked among the second tier of American presidents." Early life, childhood and family history. Stephen Grover Cleveland was born on March 18, 1837, in Caldwell, New Jersey to Richard Foley Cleveland and N. Neil Cleveland. Cleveland, the fifth of 9 children, was named Stephen Grover in honor of the first pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Caldwell, where his father was pastor at the time. He became known as Grover in his adult life. In 1850, Cleveland's father took a pastorate in Clinton, Oneida County, New York, and the family relocated there. Education and moving west. Cleveland received his elementary education at the Fayetteville Academy and the Clinton Liberal Academy. Early career in the Civil War. Cleveland worked for the Rogers firm for 3 years, then left in 1862 to start his own practice. As a lawyer, Cleveland became known for his single-minded concentration and dedication to hard work. Political career in New York. Sheriff of Erie County. From his earliest involvement in politics, Cleveland aligned with the Democratic Party. Cleveland's service as sheriff was unremarkable. Biographer Rexford Tugwell described the time in office as a waste for Cleveland politically. Cleveland was aware of graft in the sheriff's office during his tenure and chose not to confront it. After his term as sheriff ended, Cleveland returned to his law practice, opening a firm with his friends Lyman K. Bass and Wilson S. Bissell. It was during this period that Cleveland began a relationship with a widow, Maria Crofts Halpin, and later assumed responsibility for supporting her and a child born at the time. The matter became a campaign issue for the GOP in his first presidential campaign. Mayor of Buffalo. In the 1870s, the municipal government in Buffalo had grown increasingly corrupt, with Democratic and Republican political machines cooperating to share the spoils of political office. He took office January 2, 1882. Cleveland's term as mayor was spent fighting the entrenched interests of the party machines. Governor of New York. New York Democratic Party officials began to consider Cleveland a possible nominee for governor. Cleveland brought his opposition to needless spending to the governor's office. He promptly sent the legislature 8 vetoes in his first 2 months in office. Cleveland's defiance of political corruption won him popular acclaim, and the enmity of the influential Tammany Hall organization in New York City. Election of 1884. Nomination for president. The Republicans convened in Chicago and nominated former Speaker of the House James G. Blaine of Maine for president on the 4th ballot. Blaine's nomination alienated many Republicans who viewed Blaine as ambitious and immoral. Among the Democrats, Samuel J. Tilden was the initial frontrunner, having been the party's nominee in the contested election of 1876. Campaign against Blaine. Corruption in politics was the central issue in 1884. Indeed, Blaine had over the span of his career been involved in several questionable deals. The campaign focused on the candidates' moral standards, as each side cast aspersions on their opponents. Cleveland supporters rehashed the old allegations that Blaine had corruptly influenced legislation in favor of the Little Rock and Fort Smith Railroad and the Union Pacific Railway. Later profiting on the sale of bonds he owned in both companies. Regarding Cleveland, commentator Jeff Jacoby notes that, "Not since George Washington had a candidate for president been so renowned for his rectitude." Quote, "The electoral votes of closely contested New York, New Jersey, Indiana, and Connecticut would determine the election." After the votes were counted, Cleveland narrowly won all 4 of the swing states, including New York by 1,200 votes. First term as president. Reform. Soon after taking office, Cleveland was faced with the task of filling all the government jobs for which the president had the power of appointment. These jobs were typically filled under the spoils system. But Cleveland announced that he would not fire any Republican who was doing his job well, and would not appoint anyone solely on the basis of party service. Cleveland also reformed other parts of the government. In 1887, he signed an act creating the Interstate Commerce Commission. Cleveland was the first Democratic president subject to the Tenure of Office Act, which originated in 1867. The act purported to require the Senate to approve the dismissal of any presidential appointee who was originally subject to its advice and consent. Cleveland objected to the act in principle, and his steadfast refusal to abide by it prompted its fall into disfavor and led to its ultimate repeal in 1887. Vetoes. I can find no warrant for such an appropriation in the Constitution, and I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. A prevalent tendency to disregard the limited mission of this power and duty should, I think, be steadfastly resisted, to the end that the lesson should be constantly enforced that, though the people support the government should not support the people. The friendliness and charity of our countrymen can always be relied upon to relieve their fellow citizens in misfortune. This has been repeatedly and quite lately demonstrated. Federal aid in such cases encourages the expectation of paternal care on the part of the government and weakens the sturdiness of our national character, while it prevents the indulgence among our people of that kindly sentiment and conduct which strengthens the bonds of a common brotherhood. Silver. One of the most volatile issues of the 1880s was whether the currency should be backed by gold and silver, or by gold alone. Cleveland and Treasury Secretary Daniel Manning stood firmly on the side of the gold standard, and tried to reduce the amount of silver that the government was required to coin under the Bland-Allison Act of 1878. Tariffs. When we consider that the theory of our institutions guarantees to every citizen the full enjoyment of all the fruits of his industry and enterprise, with only such deduction as may be his share toward the careful and economical maintenance of the government which protects him, it is plain that the exaction of more than this is indefensible extortion and a culpable betrayal of American fairness and justice. The public treasury, which should only exist as a conduit conveying the people's tribute to its legitimate objects of expenditure, becomes a hoarding place for money needlessly withdrawn from trade and the people's use, thus crippling our national energies, suspending our country's development, preventing investment in productive enterprise, threatening financial disturbance, and inviting schemes of public plunder. Quote, another contentious financial issue at the time was the protective tariff. While it had not been a central point in his campaign, Cleveland's opinion on the tariff was that of most Democrats, that the tariff had to be reduced. In 1886, a bill to reduce the tariff was narrowly defeated in the House. The Republican Senate failed to come to agreement with the Democratic House, and the bill died in the conference committee. Dispute over the tariff persisted into the 1888 presidential election. Foreign policy, 1885 to 1889. Cleveland was a committed non-interventionist who had campaigned in opposition to expansion and imperialism. He refused to promote the previous administration's Nicaragua Canal Treaty, and generally was less of an expansionist in foreign relations. Military policy, 1885 to 1889. Cleveland's military policy emphasized self-defense and modernization. In 1885, Cleveland appointed the Board of Fortifications under Secretary of War William C. Endicott to recommend a new coastal fortification system for the United States. Civil rights and immigration. Cleveland, like a growing number of Northerners, and nearly all white Southerners, saw Reconstruction as a failed experiment, and was reluctant to use federal power to enforce the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which guaranteed voting rights to African Americans. Although Cleveland had condemned the outrages against Chinese immigrants, he believed that Chinese immigrants were unwilling to assimilate into white society. Indian policy. Cleveland viewed Native Americans as wards of the state, saying in his first inaugural address that, in the month before Cleveland's 1885 inauguration, President Arthur opened 4 million acres of Winnebago and Crow Creek Indian lands in the Dakota Territory to white settlement by executive order. Marriage and children. Cleveland entered the White House as a bachelor, and his sister Rose Cleveland joined him to act as hostess for the first 2 years of his administration. The Clevelands had 5 children: Ruth, Esther, Marion, Richard F. Folsom, and Frances Grover. British philosopher Philippa Foot was their granddaughter. Administration and cabinet. Back row, left to right: William F. Velas, William C. Whitney, William C. Endicott, Augustus H. Garland. Judicial appointments. During his first term, Cleveland successfully nominated 2 justices to the Supreme Court of the United States. The first, Lucius Q. C. Lamar, was a former Mississippi senator who served in Cleveland's cabinet as Interior Secretary. When William Burnham Woods died, Cleveland nominated Lamar to his seat in late 1887. While Lamar had been well-liked as a senator, his service under the Confederacy 2 decades earlier caused many Republicans to vote against him. Lamar's nomination was confirmed by the narrow margin of 32 to 28. Chief Justice Morrison Waite died a few months later, and Cleveland nominated Melville Fuller to fill his seat on April 30, 1888. Fuller accepted. He had previously declined Cleveland's nomination to the Civil Service Commission, preferring his Chicago law practice. The Senate Judiciary Committee spent several months examining the little-known nominee, before the Senate confirmed the nomination 41 to 20. Cleveland nominated 41 lower federal court judges in addition to his 4 Supreme Court justices. These included 2 judges to the United States Circuit Courts, 9 judges to the United States Courts of Appeals, and 30 judges to the United States District Courts. Because Cleveland served terms both before and after Congress eliminated the circuit courts in favor of the Courts of Appeals, he is one of only 2 presidents to have appointed judges to both bodies. The other, Benjamin Harrison, was in office at the time that the change was made. Thus, all of Cleveland's appointments to the circuit courts were made in his first term, and all of his appointments to the Courts of Appeals were made in his second. Election of 1888 and return to private life. Defeated by Harrison. The Republicans nominated Benjamin Harrison of Indiana for president and Levi P. Morton of New York for vice president. Cleveland was easily renominated at the Democratic Convention in St. Louis. The Republicans gained the upper hand in the campaign, as Cleveland's campaign was poorly managed by Calvin S. Bryce and William H. Barnum, whereas Harrison had engaged more aggressive fundraisers and tacticians in Matt Key and John Wanamaker. The Republicans campaigned heavily on the tariff issue, turning out protectionist voters in the important industrial states of the North. A letter from the British ambassador supporting Cleveland caused a scandal which cost Cleveland votes in New York. As in 1884, the election focused on the swing states of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Indiana, but unlike that year, when Cleveland had triumphed in all 4, in 1888 he won only 2, losing his home state of New York by 373 votes. Private citizen for 4 years. As Frances Cleveland left the White House, she told a staff member, "Now, Jerry, I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now, when we come back again." Quote, when asked when she would return, she responded, "We are coming back 4 years from today." Quote, the Harrison administration worked with Congress to pass the McKinley Tariff, an aggressively protectionist measure, and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which increased money backed by silver. Election of 1892. Democratic nomination. Cleveland's enduring reputation as chief executive and his recent pronouncements on the monetary issues made him a leading contender for the Democratic nomination. Campaign against Harrison. The Republicans renominated President Harrison, making the 1892 election a rematch of the one 4 years earlier. Unlike the turbulent and controversial elections of 1876, 1884, and 1888, the 1892 election was, according to Cleveland biographer Allen Nevins, the cleanest, quietest, and most creditable in the memory of the post-war generation. Harrison did not personally campaign at all. Following Caroline Harrison's death on October 25, 2 weeks before the national election, Cleveland and all of the other candidates stopped campaigning, thus making Election Day a somber and quiet event for the whole country as well as the candidates. The issue of the tariff worked to the Republicans' advantage in 1888. The legislative revisions of the past 4 years also made imported goods so expensive that now many voters favored tariff reform and were skeptical of big business. Second term as president. Economic panic and the silver issue. Shortly after Cleveland's second term began, the panic of 1893 struck the stock market, and he soon faced an acute economic depression. Tariff reform. Having succeeded in reversing the Harrison administration's silver policy, Cleveland sought next to reverse the effects of the McKinley tariff. The Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act was introduced by West Virginian Representative William L. Wilson in December 1893. The bill was next considered in the Senate, where it faced stronger opposition from key Democrats, led by Arthur Pugh Gorman of Maryland, who insisted on more protection for their state's industries than the Wilson bill allowed. Voting rights. In 1892, Cleveland had campaigned against the Lodge Bill. The pendulum thus swung from stronger attempts to protect voting rights to the repealing of voting rights protections. This in turn led to unsuccessful attempts to have the federal courts protect voting rights in Giles v. Harris, 189 U.S. 475, and Giles v. Teasley, 193 U.S. 146. John T. Morgan, senator from Alabama, opposed Cleveland on free silver, the tariff, and the Hawaii Treaty, saying of Cleveland that, "I hate the ground that man walks on." Quote. Labor unrest. The Panic of 1893 had damaged labor conditions across the United States, and the victory of anti-silver legislation worsened the mood of Western laborers. Pullman Strike. The Pullman Strike had a significantly greater impact than Coxey's Army. A strike began against the Pullman Company over low wages and 12-hour workdays, and sympathy strikes, led by American Railway Union leader Eugene V. Debs, soon followed. We are on the eve of. The warning was appropriate, for in the congressional elections, Republicans won their biggest landslide in decades, taking full control of the House, while the Populists lost most of their support. Cleveland's factional enemies gained control of the Democratic Party in state after state, including full control in Illinois and Michigan, and made major gains in Ohio, Indiana, Iowa and other states. Wisconsin and Massachusetts were two of the few states that remained under the control of Cleveland's allies. The Democratic opposition were close to controlling two-thirds of the vote at the 1896 National Convention, which they needed to nominate their own candidate. They failed for lack of unity and a national leader, as Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld had been born in Germany and was ineligible to be nominated for president. Foreign policy, 1893 to 1897. I suppose that right and justice should determine the path to be followed in treating this subject. If national honesty is to be disregarded and a desire for territorial expansion or dissatisfaction with a form of government not our own ought to regulate our conduct, I have entirely misapprehended the mission and character of our government and the behavior which the conscience of the people demands of their public servants. Quote. When Cleveland took office he faced the question of Hawaiian annexation. In his first term, he had supported free trade with Hawaii and accepted an amendment that gave the United States a coaling-in naval station in Pearl Harbor. Cleveland agreed with Blount's report, which found the populace to be opposed to annexation. Closer to home, Cleveland adopted a broad interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine that not only prohibited new European colonies, but also declared an American national interest in any matter of substance within the hemisphere. Military policy, 1893 to 1897. The second Cleveland administration was as committed to military modernization as the first, and ordered the first ships of a navy capable of offensive action. Construction continued on the Endicott program of coastal fortifications begun under Cleveland's first administration. Cancer. In the midst of the fight for a repeal of free silver coinage in 1893, Cleveland sought the advice of the White House Dr. O'Reilly about soreness on the roof of his mouth and the crater-like edge ulcer with a granulated surface on the left side of Cleveland's hard palate. Samples of the tumor were sent anonymously to the Army Medical Museum. The diagnosis was not a malignant cancer, but instead an epithelioma. Cleveland decided to have surgery secretly, to avoid further panic that might worsen the financial depression. Cleveland enjoyed many years of life after the tumor was removed, and there was some debate as to whether it was actually malignant. Several doctors, including Drive Keene, stated after Cleveland's death that the tumor was a carcinoma. Administration and Cabinet. Front row, left to right: Daniel S. Lamont, Richard Olney, Cleveland; John G. Carlisle, Judson Harmon. Judicial appointments. Cleveland's trouble with the Senate hindered the success of his nominations to the Supreme Court in his second term. In 1893, after the death of Samuel Blatchford, Cleveland nominated William B. Hornblower to the court. Cleveland continued to defy the Senate by next appointing Wheeler Hazard Peckham, another New York attorney who had opposed Hill's machine in that state. States admitted to the Union. No new states were admitted to the Union during Cleveland's first term. However, on February 22, 1889, 10 days before leaving office, the 50th Congress passed the Enabling Act of 1889, authorizing North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington to form state governments and to gain admission to the Union. All four officially became states in November 1889. During the first year of Benjamin Harrison's administration, Utah joined the Union as the 45th state on January 4, 1896. 1896 election and retirement. Cleveland's agrarian and Silverite enemies gained control of the Democratic Party in 1896, repudiated his administration and the gold standard, and nominated William Jennings Bryan on a silver platform. Outgoing President Grover Cleveland, at right, stands nearby as William McKinley is sworn in as president by Chief Justice Melville Fuller. After leaving the White House on March 4, 1897, Cleveland lived in retirement at his estate, Westland Mansion, in Princeton, New Jersey. In 1906, a group of New Jersey Democrats promoted Cleveland as a possible candidate for the United States Senate. The incumbent, John F. Dryden, was not seeking re-election, and some Democrats felt that the former president could attract the votes of some disaffected Republican legislators who might be drawn to Cleveland's statesmanship and conservatism. Cleveland's health had been declining for several years, and in the autumn of 1907 he fell seriously ill. Honors and memorials. In his first term in office, Cleveland sought a summer house to escape the heat and smells of Washington, D.C. Near enough the capital, he secretly bought a farmhouse, Oakview, or Oak Hill, in a rural upland part of the District of Columbia, in 1886, and remodeled it into a Queen Anne-style summer estate. He sold Oakview upon losing his bid for re-election in 1888. Not long thereafter, suburban residential development reached the area, which came to be known as Oakview, and then Cleveland Heights, and eventually Cleveland Park. Grover Cleveland Hall at Buffalo State College in Buffalo, New York. Cleveland Hall houses the offices of the college president, vice presidents, and other administrative functions and student services. Cleveland was a member of the first board of directors of the then Buffalo Normal School. The first U.S. postage stamp to honor Cleveland appeared in 1923. This 12-cent issue accompanied a 13-cent stamp in the same definitive series that depicted his old rival Benjamin Harrison. Cleveland's only two subsequent stamp appearances have been in issues devoted to the full roster of U.S. presidents, released, respectively, in 1938 and 1986. Cleveland's portrait was on the U.S. $1,000 bill of Series 1928 and Series 1934. He also appeared on the first few issues of the $20 Federal Reserve notes from 1914. Since he was both the 22nd and 24th president, he was featured on two separate dollar coins released in 2012 as part of the Presidential $1 Coin Act of 2005.